He didn't leave. He replaced me. He was still there. That's why it took so long to notice. Nothing looked broken. He didn't leave in a dramatic way. There was no slammed door, no overnight bag, no final argument that people talk about later. He was still there, still waking up before his alarm, still brushing his teeth the same way, tapping the sink twice before turning off the water. Still asking if I wanted coffee, even though he already knew I did. That was the part that fooled me. Everything stayed functional. Our life kept running, like a machine that hadn't realized one of its parts was already missing. If someone had asked me then if something was wrong, I would have said no. Or maybe, not really. Because nothing had been removed yet. Nothing obvious. He wasn't distant in the way movies teach you to recognize. He was present, just thinner, like a voice lowered by one notch, like a light that still works, but no longer warms the room. At night, he lay beside me, facing the same direction as always. His back felt familiar, safe. I didn't notice that it no longer felt like mine. I thought closeness was measured by proximity. I didn't know yet that replacement doesn't require absence. It only requires space. The first thing to move wasn't me, it was time. Small pieces at first, barely noticeable, conversations shortened, plans adjusted. Later became the default answer. Not no, just not now. That distinction mattered more than I understood then, because later keeps hope alive. It tells you you're still in line, even when someone else has already stepped ahead of you. He was busy, but not unavailable, tired, but not exhausted. There was always enough energy left, just not for the things that used to belong to us. He still laughed, still focused, still cared, just selectively. I started editing myself without realizing it, talking faster, asking less, timing my thoughts around his mood. I didn't call it compromise. I called it understanding. Looking back, that's when the replacement began. Not with another person, but with another priority. Something invisible that absorbed his attention so completely there was no room left over. I wasn't pushed out. I was quietly moved aside. Like furniture rearranged to make space for something newer, something more essential. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt delayed. And somehow that hurt more, because it implied I was still wanted, just not urgently. I started doing the math without meaning to, counting minutes, measuring responses, comparing effort. It wasn't jealousy, it was accounting. If time was limited, I wanted to understand why I was suddenly receiving less of it. He still gave so much, to work, to routines, to things that never questioned him. He just stopped giving to me. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in during ordinary moments, when I waited for him to finish something that never seemed to end. When I watched him light up over details he no longer noticed in my voice. When my stories felt like interruptions instead of connections. I told myself it was temporary. Everyone goes through phases. Relationships stretch and contract. This was just a contraction. I didn't see that it was a redistribution. Emotional resources don't disappear. They get reassigned. And mine had been slowly transferred elsewhere. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier. Anger means you still feel chosen enough to protest. What I felt was quieter, a dull pressure, like standing in a room where the air keeps thinning, but no one else seems to notice. I didn't feel replaced yet. I just felt unnecessary. There was no clear her, no name to attach the feeling to. That made it worse, because I couldn't compete with something I couldn't see. It wasn't another woman sitting across from him. It was a version of life where I no longer fit naturally, a schedule that didn't bend, a rhythm that didn't include me. I could feel it, though, the presence, like walking into a room that had already been lived in by someone else. The space was familiar, but rearranged. Things no longer landed where they used to. My words felt heavier, like they required permission now. He didn't hide anything. That's what confused me. There were no secrets to uncover, no messages to find, just an absence of space, an absence of need. I realized then that replacement doesn't always come in the form of betrayal. Sometimes it arrives as optimization, a life refined until it no longer requires you. I tried to adjust myself to fit again, softer, quieter, more convenient. But the space I was shrinking into wasn't empty. It was already occupied by something that didn't argue, didn't feel, didn't ask to be seen. How do you compete with something that never asks for anything at all? The moment I understood wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with tears or shouting. It came during a pause. One of those silences where you're supposed to feel comfortable. I realized I was the only one paying attention to it. He was already elsewhere, even while sitting next to me. That's when it clicked. He didn't choose someone else over me. He chose a life where I wasn't necessary. A life that ran smoother without my emotions, my questions, my presence. I wasn't replaced by a person. I was replaced by efficiency. It hurt in a way that felt almost impersonal, like being laid off instead of broken up with. No one was angry. No one was cruel. I just no longer served a function. I had become extra. I thought about all the times I'd waited, adjusted, reduced myself. Not because he asked me to, but because the structure of his life made it clear there was no room for excess. And I was the excess. Understanding that didn't make it better, but it made it final. There was nothing left to fix because nothing was technically broken. I hadn't been abandoned. I had been phased out. After that, things continued as usual. That was the strangest part. The damage didn't announce itself. It didn't disrupt routines. It just settled in quietly, like dust you stop noticing until it coats everything. I stopped waiting for moments that never came. Stopped initiating conversations that felt like paperwork. He didn't notice the shift, or maybe he did and chose not to name it. Either way, the silence between us grew more efficient. We communicated just enough to keep things running. Logistics replaced intimacy. Coordination replaced closeness. I didn't cry much. There was nothing to cry about. Crying implies loss, and technically nothing had been taken. He was still there, still present, still polite. I felt ridiculous, mourning something that hadn't officially ended. But inside, something had stopped responding, like a muscle that goes unused for too long. I could feel myself becoming quieter, flatter, not numb, just compressed. I existed in his life the way background apps exist on a phone. Running, but irrelevant. That's the kind of damage no one warns you about. The kind that doesn't leave marks, doesn't justify explanations. The kind that happens when you're replaced, but expected to stay. I stayed longer than I should have, not because I hoped he'd change, but because nothing told me I had to leave. There was no clear ending, no line crossed, just a gradual understanding that I was no longer central to my own relationship. Leaving felt dramatic. Staying felt reasonable. That's how replacement traps you. It convinces you that leaving would be an overreaction, while staying slowly erases you. I chose reason, and it cost me pieces I didn't notice disappearing. I watched myself adapt to less. Less attention, less warmth, less space. I became proud of my ability to handle it, of not needing too much, of being easy. I didn't realize I was training myself to accept absence as normal. He never asked me to shrink. That's the part people don't understand. He didn't have to. The structure of his life did it for him. There was no room for someone like me anymore. And instead of questioning that, I tried to become someone else. Staying wasn't loyalty, it was inertia. And inertia can look a lot like love when you're afraid to admit you've already been replaced. Once you see replacement for what it is, you can't unsee it. Every interaction becomes evidence, not of betrayal, but of omission, of how easily your presence is bypassed, how smoothly things function without you at the center. I noticed how decisions were made without consulting me, how plans didn't include me by default anymore, how my absence wouldn't disrupt anything. I had become optional, and optional is dangerous because it sounds like freedom when it's actually erasure. He wasn't cruel. That made it harder. There was no villain to point at, just a man living a life optimized for himself. A life where love existed, but only in ways that didn't interfere. I realized then that being replaced quietly is worse than being left loudly. Loud endings give you clarity. Quiet replacements leave you doubting your own worth, wondering if you're imagining things, wondering if wanting more makes you unreasonable. I wasn't unreasonable. I was just in a life that no longer required me, and that understanding was the beginning of the end, even if nothing ended right away. When I finally stopped trying, no one noticed immediately. That's how I knew it was already over. My silence blended perfectly into the existing gaps. My absence didn't create a problem, it just made things simpler. I didn't leave in anger, I didn't demand explanations. There was nothing to confront. You can't argue with a structure, you can't negotiate your way back into relevance. So I stepped out quietly, the same way I had been replaced. He asked if something was wrong. I said no. And for once, that wasn't a lie. Nothing was wrong anymore. Nothing was mine either. I had accepted what had been true for a long time. Walking away didn't feel like loss. It felt like finally aligning my actions with reality. I wasn't chosen. I was tolerated. And that's not something you fix with communication. He didn't chase. That confirmed everything. Not because he didn't care, but because the life he'd built didn't need to adjust for my absence. Replacement had already done its work. I don't think about him with anger now. I think about the version of myself that stayed too long, mistaking quiet displacement for stability. I think about how easy it is to disappear without anyone ever telling you to go. He didn't leave me. He replaced me, quietly, efficiently, and expected me to remain grateful for still being there, for still having a place, even if it wasn't mine anymore. I learned that love doesn't always end with rejection. Sometimes it ends with optimization, with a life so carefully arranged that there's no space left for anyone who requires presence, emotion, or inconvenience. Being replaced quietly teaches you a specific lesson, not about other people, but about yourself, about how long you're willing to stay where you're no longer needed, about how much absence you'll accept before you finally name it. I don't regret leaving. I regret how long I tried to fit into a space that was already occupied, not by someone else, but by a version of life where I had already been erased.